Hello, good morning. It's a beautiful morning here with a bright blue sky in Holland. And I want to read a book that is called I is a Door. It's written by my friend Philip Renard, who's already been teaching Advaita Vedanta non-duality for more than 20 years. And Philip has written several books, of which I is a Door is one. The original is written in Dutch, and Philip has this capacity to really capture in Dutch, uh, something that is often very difficult to express, and that's why I love his books very much, because the language he brings the Dutch language to life, and he really brings to life this topic of non-duality in a way that's not easy to do. So we're going to read the English translation of this book, I is a Door, in which he describes, because it's a thin little book, this is the book, the Dutch one, and he describes in there how the three great teachers of the last century, Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and Sri Atmananda, how they work with the concept I. And again, each one of the descriptions in a few pages, he manages to really give you a beautiful taste of how they worked with that concept as a door, as a doorway. And so here we go. The English, I have it online, so let me just go there. Okay, this is the introduction of the book, I is a Door. One of the expressions often heard on the path of self-realization is letting go of the ego. So, what do we actually mean by this? It is, of course, not about the common form of ego, which everybody recognizes as egoism or selfishness, because it is clear that selfishness is in fact rejected by everybody. But being on a way of liberation or not, being on a way of liberation or not. Letting go of this gross kind of ego is not enough if you really want liberation. The ego is mentioned by teachers of the Vedic and Buddhist ways of liberation as being the primary obstacle, is a thinking activity in which you identify yourself with an external figure which consequently can be seen and judged. A figure which could be imagined as being higher or lower than others. This ego, in fact, consists of acts of comparison. It could also be called self-consciousness, with all its implied inhibitions of spontaneity or aliveness. It refers to the built-in split, a habitual groove in which one looks at another part of the same ego from a critical point of view and bombards it with conflicting opinions. A principal characteristic of the ego is the attachment to the opinions about oneself. That is to say, a self-image has been built that does not want to dissolve and would rather continue exactly as it is. This is what we call the person. It is the maintenance of a self-image. When it comes to the person, each conscious activity of the body-mind involves the supposition that there is an I doing something, and that this I is a continuous, enduring entity. I prefer to call this ah, I prefer to call this the I rather than the ego, because this is easier to recognize as being something more subtle than the gross ego mentioned earlier, even though the two flow into one another. The main difference, one could say, in the case of the gross ego, it is others that bother you and are bothered by you, whereas in the case of this subtle I, it is you being bothered by yourself. Both Buddhists and Vedantins agree that this subtle I should be given up if you want liberation, but they disagree about the terminology and how belief in this I can be annihilated. The Buddhists say there is no entity at all, no self, no I, just a sequence of causal, conditioned psychic and physical processes. For the rest, they don't talk about an I. They even disapprove of talking in terms of I. For instance, in a statement like, when we regard the nature of this knowing as being me or I and hold on to that concept, this is a small view. It's a mistaken, confused view. That being said, in Dzogchen, the radical non-dualistic core of Tibetan Buddhism, from which the last quote originated, a number of texts have been produced in the past in which the term I is used, even with emphasis, to point out the highest principle as being the majestic creativity of the universe. In one of the root texts of Dzogchen, the Kunyet Gyalpo, it is stated, I, the creativity of the universe, pure and total presence, am the real heart of all spiritual pursuits. And, because all phenomena are none other than me, I, the all creating one, am the decisive experience of everything. From texts like these, it becomes apparent how comparative the term I actually is. The same term that deserves to be disapproved as signifying a mistake is apparently also used to denote the highest principle. The term I is often put in the mouth of the ultimate or the supreme being in the scriptures of the different monotheistic religions. It appears that in origin, I even belongs to his name. On his question to be allowed to hear the name of God, Moses, who has been acknowledged as a religious leader and prophet by the Jews as well as Christians and Muslims, received the answer, I am that I am. Iye Asher Eye. This well may be the name of names. I am that I am. The heart of the matter that addresses itself. Sri Ramana Maharshi, one of the teachers highlighted in this book, said about this name that no definition of God was as well formulated as this one. He addressed this statement repeatedly. Once he said, it is said, I am that I am. That means a person must abide as I. He is always the I alone. He is nothing else. Such a way of expressing is not very customary in a monotheistic religion. The shift from the Supreme Being via an identical name to me, a mortal being, is not customary. Usually a distance, a gap, is maintained. The ultimate is immense and I am small. That's why speaking about the ultimate in first person grammar, literally I, is in generally not customary in religion. No, it is common to speak in third person, usually he, which means a speaking about him, with a capital H. If texts are put in the second person, phrasing a dialogue, for instance in the book of Job, they are already conspicuous. The language is somewhat more direct. The reader may feel more involved. Still, it is a different thing when you indicate yourself and the ultimate with the same word, in essence first person, thus bridging the deepest gap. Ramana Maharshi was quite impressive in giving credibility to bridging this gap. Time after time, he showed that reality is that what counts in religion, a reality that is non-dual, meaning that contradictory opinions about the ultimate are not real because reality precedes them. An example of a controversial subject is the question whether God is personal or impersonal. But to Ramana, there was no contradiction. To the question whether God is personal or not, he replied, yes, he is always the first person, I, ever standing before you. Because you give precedence to worldly things, God appears to have receded to the background. If you give up all worldly things and seek Him alone, He alone will remain as I, the Self. This is an invitation to see that worldly matters, in essence everything that is an object to us, only exist thanks to the knowing of them, and that God is never an object to be known. Then it is apparent that that which is not an object cannot be different from that which is knowing now, knowingness or seeing itself. This knowingness or seeing is uninterrupted I. It is the most immediate there is. Even standing before you, like in Ramana's quote, is in comparison far away, being just a figure of speech. And follows a quote. In the beginning, this world was only the self, in the shape of a person. This was stated in the oldest Upanishad, as early as the 8th century before Christ. Looking around, he saw nothing else than the self. He first said, I am. Therefore arose the name I. Therefore, even to this day, when one is addressed, he says first, this is I, and then speaks whatever other name he may have. Ramana added to this, speaking about the word I, aham. That is the original name of reality. I, aham, is the first name of God. The first letter in Sanskrit is A, and the last letter Ha, and aha thus includes everything from beginning to the end. In Advaita Vedanta, one of the traditions that emerged from the Upanishads, the term I, aham, is repeatedly being used, usually to denote the ego, the separate entity, but frequently also to show by means of this familiar term the entrance to recognize oneself as the ultimate principle. The text fragments in which the great statement, I am the Absolute, Aham Brahma Ashmi, is emphasized and commented on by Shankara and his students and followers, are famous. This statement was made in the Upanishad from which was cited above, actually in line with that text fragment. It says Brahman indeed was this whole universe in the beginning. It knew itself only as I am Brahman. Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, the teacher who is discussed in chapter 3, entitled his book that appeared in the English language, I Am That. In the Advaita tradition, the term that signifies the Absolute. In a way, one could say that by this statement, Nisargadatta joined the Advaita tradition, but that is only partially true. He pointed to the essence of Advaita, indeed, but at the same time he very often rejected all kinds of tradition, not only the Advaitic. He actually also rejected everything that was ever written down, even the Upanishads. Seeing that you are that, absolute awareness, was the only thing that mattered to him. He considered the rest as being needless philosophy. Nisargadatta touched a crucial point here that should be acknowledged, in my opinion. The point is that no matter how great a certain tradition may have been in its core, it may not have succeeded in staying free of rigidity. Whether this has been caused by too much emphasis on philosophical argumentation, or a holding on to rituals, or ascetic commitments and prohibitions, rigidity can often be identified, also in Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Although both the other teachers in this book apparently spoke somewhat more than Nisargadatta did, the language of the scholastic Advaita, they too can be considered as restorers of the primal core of Advaita Vedanta, or put differently, the core of true non-duality that does not acknowledge religious or ethnical restrictions. All three of them showed that non-dualism is truly universal and not a branch of Hinduism. Ramana Maharshi, who usually adopted the terminology of Advaita Vedanta, could be very critical about Advaita, as if he had no part in it. In particular, he could not appreciate its endless philosophizing and classifying. Sri Atmananda, also known as Sri Krishna Menon, the teacher that is highlighted in chapter 2, was seemingly more established in the tradition of Shankara's Vedanta. At least he very often spoke in words of praise about it. He said, for instance, Vedanta is, strictly speaking, the fulfillment of all religions. And Vedanta is really a spiritual bomb, atom bomb, and it is no wonder that the intellectuals tremble to approach it. But despite his enthusiastic talk, he's not a member of the scholastic and conditional form that Shankara's tradition adopted. All three teachers who will be discussed in this book are free from whatever religious scheme, therefore making them in particular suitable as a source of teaching for Westerners. I consider these three, Ramana Maharshi, Atmananda, and Nisargadatta Maharaj, as the big three of the 20th century Advaita Vedanta. To me, they are the ones that reduced Advaita to the heart of the matter, direct recognition of your true nature. All three of them used the word I in a constituent term to point to the ultimate principle. The first two spoke in terms of I, and I principle, respectively. And Nisargadatta offered his two-step approach, I am principle, and I the absolute. With this, they showed that the way is a direct way in the first place, a way that cannot be found anywhere else than with you, with the direct experience of I. I don't know of any teacher or writer from East or West who has investigated the truth of what I really is so thoroughly as these three. I don't know any teacher either who has shown in a comparable way how I is really the entrance for the most immediate there is. These three teachers have shown clearly that true Advaita Vedanta True non-dualism is not a path of knowledge or philosophy, but a path without methods, a pathless path of liberation, an invitation to go nowhere. This booklet, I as a Door, is dedicated to this theme. It gives a view on the essence of Advaita Vedanta, the core of which is the present realization of freedom. It offers a short overview of the phenomenon that in the Advaita of the Big Three, the term I is retained, even to designate the highest level of reality, the level that is prior to and beyond the person. Retaining this term is an aid because it points out that the sense of I that seems to belong, excuse me, wait a second. I read that again. Retaining this term is an aid because it points out that the sense of I that seems to belong to the person so obviously is in fact deeper than this temporary person, and that this sense of I is uninterruptedly present even right now. So it is not necessary to eliminate or exclude something in order to be in contact with the reality that you are. I signifies that which is limitless light and sheer freedom. I is what everybody says. I is the closest there is to anyone. Everyone recognizes it as utmost familiar, completely oneself already now. It is all about self-realization. You have to see the truth yourself and realize it. I is that which is always present, which turns out to be the entrance to the truth. The entrance will never be anywhere else. It doesn't need to be searched. You don't have to go anywhere to experience I. Wherever you go, you're already there. I is already there. I is a door, and it is always open. And that's the end of the introduction. And tomorrow I'm going to read chapter 1. I think he starts with Ramana Maharshi. So have a great day.